Dad, please don't drink that, Wendy's voice cracked through the phone line, breathless and desperate. On the other end, Ethan Mark froze, his hand hovering over the glass of bourbon his wife Lucy had just poured him. His face drained of color. Wendy, he whispered, his chest tightening. You're dead. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the sound of a lie shattering into 1,000 pieces. Because somewhere in the woods of rural Virginia, his daughter, the one he'd buried 2 months ago, was running for her life. The autumn wind cut through Rock Creek Cemetery in Washington, D.C., carrying with it the scent of damp leaves and something heavier: loss. Ethan Mark, one of the wealthiest men in America, knelt alone before a polished marble headstone. His Armani suit was wrinkled. His eyes were bloodshot. In his hand, he clutched a silver bracelet, small, delicate, engraved with the words "Daddy's Girl Forever." He pressed it to his lips and let out a sound that didn't belong to a man of his stature. It was raw, broken. The sound of a father who believed his only child was gone. "How am I supposed to keep going, Wendy?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "You promised me you'd never leave. You promised." The gravestone stared back at him in silence. Wendy Elise Mark, January 14, 1998 to September 3, 2024. Beloved daughter. Forever in our hearts. Ethan's chest heaved. He'd been told the fire was an accident. A tragic, unforeseeable accident at his brother Greg's cabin in the Shenandoah Valley. Wendy had gone there for a weekend retreat with Lucy, Ethan's wife of 3 years. Lucy said she'd stepped out to grab groceries. By the time she returned, the cabin was engulfed in flames. Firefighters found remains. Personal belongings. A ring Wendy always wore. Ethan never questioned it. Why would he? Lucy was devastated. Greg was devastated. The whole family mourned. But what Ethan didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that 20 yards behind him, hidden behind the thick trunk of an old oak tree, his daughter was watching him. Wendy Mark was alive. Her hands trembled as she gripped the rough bark. Her breathing was shallow, panicked. She wanted to run to him. Wanted to scream, "Dad, I'm here. I'm right here." But she couldn't. Because if they found out she'd escaped, if Lucy or Greg discovered she was gone, they'd kill him. Tears streamed down her face as she watched her father sob. She bit down on her lip until she tasted blood, trying not to make a sound. Every fiber of her being screamed to move, but her fear was stronger. Not yet, she told herself. Not yet. Ethan finally rose to his feet, tucking the bracelet into his coat pocket like a sacred relic. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and took one last look at the grave. "I'll make them pay, baby girl," he said quietly. "Whoever did this to you, I swear to God, I'll make them pay." He turned and walked toward his black Mercedes parked along the cemetery road. Wendy watched until he disappeared from sight. Only then did she allow herself to collapse against the tree, her body shaking with silent sobs. She had no idea how close her father was to drinking his last glass of bourbon. Ethan's estate sat on 5 acres in McLean, Virginia, a sprawling colonial mansion with white columns and manicured gardens. It was the kind of house that whispered old money, legacy, power. But inside, it was a mausoleum. Lucy Mark moved through the foyer with the grace of someone who knew she was being watched. She was elegant, poised, with sharp cheekbones and blonde hair always styled to perfection. She wore mourning well, black dresses, pearls, a sad smile that made people want to comfort her. But alone in the kitchen, her mask slipped. She poured 2 glasses of whiskey and slid one across the marble island to Greg, Ethan's younger brother. Greg was handsome in a reckless way, broad shoulders, a cocky grin, the kind of man who'd spent his life in Ethan's shadow and hated every second of it. "He's getting weaker," Lucy said, her voice low. "I upped the dose yesterday. He didn't even notice." Greg swirled his drink and smirked. "How long until he's completely out of the picture?" "Another month. Maybe less." Lucy leaned against the counter, her eyes cold. "The doctors think it's grief-induced illness. Depression. No one suspects a thing." Greg laughed, a low, bitter sound. All those years watching him get everything. The company. The respect. The money. And now? It's ours. Lucy raised her glass. "To Wendy. The best investment we ever made." They clinked glasses. What they didn't know was that in a cabin 30 miles away, hidden deep in the woods of rural Fauquier County, Wendy Mark was listening. Wendy crouched in the corner of the cold, windowless room, her ear pressed against a crack in the wooden wall. She'd been held here for 2 months. No phone. No contact. Just silence and fear. But tonight, the voices were clear. She recognized them immediately. Lucy. Greg. Her stomach twisted. Her hands went numb. She pressed harder against the wall, desperate to hear every word. "She's not a problem anymore," Greg said with a laugh. "No one even knows she's alive." Lucy's voice was sharp, satisfied. And Ethan's too broken to fight back. By the time he realizes what's happening, it'll be too late. Wendy's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded so hard she thought they'd hear it. They're killing him. The realization hit her like a freight train. This wasn't just about her. This wasn't just about money. They were murdering her father. Slowly. Deliberately. And he had no idea. She slid down the wall, her body shaking. For weeks, she'd been paralyzed by fear. But now something else burned inside her. Rage. If you've ever felt helpless watching someone you love suffer, if you've ever had to choose between fear and courage, then you understand what Wendy felt in that moment. And if this story is reminding you why family is worth fighting for, don't let it slip away. Subscribe. Because what happens next will test everything she has left. Wendy didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's face at the cemetery. She heard his voice breaking as he begged a gravestone for answers. "He thinks I'm dead. He thinks he failed me." The guilt was unbearable. By dawn, she'd made her decision. She was getting out. The cabin was old, poorly maintained. The lock on her door was rusted. The window in the corner was small, but not impossible. Wendy had been watching. Waiting. Learning the patterns. Greg came by twice a day, morning and evening. Lucy almost never came at all. She had a 4-hour window. Her hands were shaking as she pried at the window frame with a piece of broken wood she'd hidden under the mattress. The frame groaned. Splintered. Finally, it gave way. Cold air rushed in. Wendy squeezed through the opening, her body scraping against the rough wood. She dropped into the dirt outside, her knees buckling on impact. Pain shot through her legs, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She ran. The woods were dense, unforgiving. Branches tore at her clothes. Roots tried to trip her. Her lungs burned. But she kept moving, driven by something stronger than fear. "I have to reach him. I have to warn him." Behind her, she heard nothing. No shouts. No footsteps. But that didn't mean she was safe. It took her 3 hours to reach the main road. Her feet were bleeding. Her clothes were torn. A passing truck driver nearly swerved off the road when he saw her stumble out of the tree line. "Jesus, kid, are you okay?" Wendy looked up at him, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "I need to get to McLean," she said, her voice hoarse. "Please. My father, he's in danger." The Mercedes pulled into the circular driveway of the McLean estate just after noon. Ethan stepped out slowly, his movements heavy, deliberate. He looked thinner than he had 2 months ago. His skin was pale. His eyes were distant. Lucy met him at the door with a concerned smile. "You're home early," she said, brushing a hand along his arm. "Are you feeling okay?" Ethan nodded, though he didn't meet her eyes. "Just tired." "I'll make you some tea," Lucy offered. "You should rest." He didn't argue. As Lucy disappeared into the kitchen, Ethan sank into the leather armchair in his study. He stared at the silver bracelet on his desk, the one he'd been holding at the cemetery. His chest felt tight. His thoughts were sluggish, clouded. "Maybe I am just tired," he thought. And then the doorbell rang. Ethan frowned. They weren't expecting anyone. Lucy's voice drifted from the kitchen. "I'll get it." But before she could reach the door, it opened. And standing in the doorway, filthy, exhausted, and trembling, was Wendy. Time stopped. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His heart slammed against his ribs. He stood slowly, his legs unsteady, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. "Wendy!" Her voice broke. "Dad." And then she ran to him. Ethan caught her in his arms, and for the first time in 2 months, he felt like he could breathe. He held her so tightly he thought he might break her. Tears poured down his face. He couldn't speak. Couldn't think. She's alive. She's alive. Behind them, Lucy stood frozen in the hallway, her face drained of color. Ethan pulled back just enough to look at Wendy's face. His hands cupped her cheeks, his eyes searching hers. How is this possible?" he whispered. "They told me you were dead. They told me." Wendy's expression hardened. She looked past him, her gaze locking onto Lucy. "Because she wanted you to think I was dead." The air in the room shifted. Ethan turned slowly, his eyes moving to Lucy. She stood perfectly still, her face a mask of shock and confusion. "Ethan, I don't know what she's talking about," Lucy said, her voice steady. "She's been through something terrible. She's confused." "I'm not confused," Wendy snapped, her voice stronger now. "I heard everything, Lucy. I heard you and Greg. I know what you've been doing." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What is she talking about?" Wendy stepped forward, her eyes burning. "They faked my death, Dad. They locked me in a cabin. And they've been poisoning you." The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Ethan stared at Lucy, his mind racing. "Poisoning?" Lucy let out a soft, disbelieving laugh. "This is insane. Ethan, she's clearly been manipulated by someone." "I heard you." Wendy shouted, her voice cracking. "I heard you laughing about it. You said you'd take everything from him. You said." "Enough." Ethan's voice was cold. Final. He looked at Lucy, and for the first time, he truly saw her. "Get out of my house." Lucy's mask finally cracked. Her eyes flashed with something dark, something desperate. But she said nothing. She just turned and walked toward the door. Before she left, she looked back at Ethan one last time. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. Then she was gone. Wendy collapsed into her father's arms again, her body shaking with sobs. Ethan held her, his mind spinning. If you've made it this far, you're not just watching a story, you're standing with a father and daughter who refuse to let evil win. Subscribe if you believe some bonds can't be broken. Because what Ethan and Wendy are about to do next will shake everything. That night, Ethan and Wendy sat in his study, the door locked, the curtains drawn. Wendy told him everything, the cabin, the conversations she'd overheard, the months of fear and isolation. Ethan listened in silence, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. When she finished, he spoke. "We're going to destroy them." Wendy looked up at him, her eyes red but resolute. "How?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind already working. "They think they've won. They think I'm weak, dying, broken. So we let them keep thinking that." Wendy frowned. "What do you mean?" Ethan's eyes darkened. "We fake my death." Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan Mark became a ghost in his own home. He stopped going to the office. He barely ate. He moved through the halls of his estate like a man waiting to die. Lucy and Greg watched from the shadows, their confidence growing with every passing day. "He's almost gone," Greg said one night over the phone. "Another week, maybe 2. Lucy smiled. Good. The sooner the better. What they didn't know was that Ethan was documenting everything. Every drink Lucy made him. Every meal she prepared. Wendy had installed cameras. Recorded conversations. Built a case. And then, on a cold November morning, Ethan Mark died. The funeral was held at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. It was a spectacle. Politicians, CEOs, socialites, all dressed in black, all whispering about the tragedy of a man who'd lost everything. Lucy played her part flawlessly. She wore a black veil. She wept at the casket. She gave a eulogy that made people cry. Greg stood beside her, his face somber, his hand on her shoulder. "He was my brother," Greg said, his voice thick with fake emotion. "And I'll make sure his legacy lives on." The room was silent. And then the doors at the back of the cathedral opened. Ethan Mark walked down the aisle, his daughter beside him. The room erupted. Gasps. Screams. Cameras flashing. Lucy's face went white. Greg stumbled backward, his mouth open in shock. Ethan didn't stop until he was standing in front of them. "Surprise," he said, his voice calm, cold. I'm not dead. But you too? You're finished. Lucy tried to speak, but no words came out. Ethan turned to the crowd, his voice carrying through the cathedral. My wife and my brother tried to kill me. They faked my daughter's death. They poisoned me for months. And they thought they'd get away with it. He pulled out a flash drive and held it up. This contains recordings, bank transfers, evidence of everything they've done. And it's already been sent to the FBI. The room exploded into chaos. Federal agents moved in from the sides of the cathedral. Lucy and Greg were surrounded. Greg lunged toward the exit, but he didn't make it 5 steps before he was tackled to the ground. Lucy stood frozen, her eyes locked on Ethan. You won't win, she hissed. Ethan stepped closer, his voice a whisper. I already have. Some stories aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that justice exists, even when it feels impossible. If this story moved you, if it made you believe again, then subscribe. Because the world needs more people who refuse to let evil win. 6 months later, Ethan and Wendy stood together at a different cemetery. This time, there was no gravestone with her name. Instead, they planted a tree, a young oak, strong and resilient. For new beginnings, Wendy said, her hand in her father's. Ethan smiled. For the first time in months, it was real. For us. They walked away together, side by side, into a future they almost lost.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.